The story begins with Jack Anderson, a successful and wealthy CEO of a prominent restaurant chain called Gourmet Haven. He had worked his way up through the business world and built his company from the ground up. Over the years, he had become used to the high-end boardrooms, luxury offices, and expensive meetings with investors. His life was all about profits, new restaurant openings, and expanding the brand. However, as time passed, Jack began to feel disconnected from the employees who worked tirelessly to make the restaurant a success. The chefs, waiters, dishwashers, and servers were the backbone of the business, but Jack had barely any interaction with them. He spent most of his time in the corporate offices, focusing on the bigger picture expansion plans and meeting targets. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting about profits, Jack walked out of his office and into the heart of one of his busiest restaurants. The loud clattering of pots and pans, the sizzling sounds of food being prepared, and the energy in the kitchen caught his attention. For a moment, he stood there, watching the hustle and bustle. It was like a whole different world. It reminded him of when he had first started out in the restaurant business, how he had worked in kitchens himself, washing dishes and waiting tables just to make ends meet. But now, years later, he rarely thought about those days. The kitchen had become a place he only visited during business meetings, and even then, it felt foreign to him. As he looked around at the employees working hard to keep everything running smoothly, he started to feel guilty. There was a wall between him and the people who made his success possible. He had become so focused on growing his business that he had lost sight of what it took to keep it going. That day, as Jack stood there in the kitchen, a thought crossed his mind. What if he could go undercover to truly understand what it was like for his employees? What if he could put himself in their shoes and experience firsthand the challenges they faced every day? He realized that the only way to truly grasp what was happening at the ground level was to step into their world without anyone knowing who he was. The idea excited him. It would be a challenge, but Jack was no stranger to challenges. He had built his empire through hard work and determination, and now he would test his leadership skills in a completely different way. He would go undercover and take on a role that no one would expect, the role of a dishwasher. Jack knew it wouldn't be easy. Dishwashing wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't the kind of job people would typically associate with the CEO of a large restaurant chain. But he was determined. He needed to see for himself what his employees were going through on a daily basis, and he needed to understand how the decisions made in the corporate offices affected the workers on the ground. The following week, Jack took action. He created a fake identity, complete with a new name and background. He reached out to one of the restaurant managers and requested to be hired on as a dishwasher for the day, explaining that he was a college student trying to make extra money. He was nervous, but he felt a rush of excitement. This was his chance to finally experience life from a different perspective. The first day on the job, Jack was shocked. The kitchen was far more hectic than he had remembered. The heat from the stoves, the constant clatter of plates and pans, the speed at which the staff worked, it was overwhelming. Jack found himself standing in front of the sink, scrubbing dishes non-stop, just trying to keep up with the flow of dirty plates. It was a relentless pace, and it made him realize how little he had appreciated the work that went into every meal that left the kitchen. Despite the stress, Jack was determined to blend in. He kept his head down and worked hard, trying to match the pace of the other dishwashers. There was one employee who caught his attention right away, Maria. She was in her late 30s, a single mother with a warm smile and a work ethic that was unmatched. Jack noticed that Maria seemed to handle everything with ease, even though the workload was overwhelming. She moved quickly between the sinks and the prep tables, never pausing for a break. But as the hours wore on, Jack began to notice something strange. Maria had been working longer than any of the other dishwashers. She was putting in double shifts, one after the other, without complaint. Jack could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but she kept pushing through. He wanted to say something, to offer help, but he knew that he had to keep up the charade. As the day went on, Jack learned more about Maria's story. During a rare moment of rest, she started talking to another dishwasher about her life. She mentioned how she had been working for the restaurant for several years, always showing up early and staying late. Despite her dedication, she had never received any special recognition or rewards. The hardest part, Maria confided, was that she had been working double shifts for weeks without being paid for the overtime. Her manager never seemed to care, and every time she asked for help or a break, she was told to keep working or there was no time. Jack's heart sank as he listened to Maria. He had always prided himself on being a fair employer, but this was something he had never considered. How could someone like Maria, who was so dedicated and hardworking, be treated this way? Jack's mind began to race. Was this happening at all his restaurants? Was he turning a blind eye to a bigger problem? That evening, after his shift ended, Jack couldn't shake the image of Maria from his mind. He had seen how hard she worked, how much she gave to the company, and yet she was being taken advantage of. He decided that he would find out more. He couldn't let this go without action. Jack knew that he had to uncover the truth about what was happening at his restaurant chain. As he left the restaurant that night, he felt a sense of urgency. This was no longer just about his undercover mission, it was about making sure that every employee at Gourmet Haven was treated with the respect and fairness they deserved. He knew that uncovering the truth about the exploitation of his employees would be a challenge, but he was ready for it. Little did he know, the journey ahead would change his perspective on leadership and business forever. The next day, Jack returned to the restaurant, determined to keep up with his undercover mission. He felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as he donned the disguise again and slipped into his role as a dishwasher. The constant hum of the kitchen was all around him, the sounds of plates clinking and chefs shouting orders, the heat from the stove adding to the pressure. Despite the overwhelming atmosphere, Jack was ready. He had something important to uncover, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. Maria was already at work when he arrived, wearing her usual tired smile as she hustled through the motions of her job. Jack watched her closely. She was quick, efficient, and clearly dedicated to her work. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for her. As he scrubbed away at the dirty dishes, he noticed how hard she worked. But what struck him even more was the quiet suffering in her eyes. She wasn't complaining, but Jack could see the exhaustion on her face. The way she moved, the subtle signs of stress in her body language. Maria had been pushing herself too hard for too long. That afternoon, Jack found himself working alongside Maria during a particularly busy shift. The restaurant was packed with customers, and the kitchen was in overdrive. Plates were piling up faster than Jack could wash them, and he could feel the pressure mounting. He saw Maria working at an even faster pace, trying to keep up with the demand. She was clearly exhausted, but she never slowed down. Jack was starting to struggle, his hands sore from the constant scrubbing. He glanced over at Maria and noticed she wasn't even taking a break, not even for a moment. She was moving so quickly that Jack was beginning to wonder how she was managing to keep up. But despite her exhaustion, Maria's focus was unwavering. She didn't let the stress of the situation get to her. Instead, she kept working, with a determination that was almost admirable. But Jack began to feel a growing sense of unease. Something wasn't right. It was clear that Maria was being pushed to the limit, and yet, no one seemed to notice. During a brief pause in the chaos, Maria took a quick breather and sat down on a stool near the sink. Jack seized the opportunity and walked over to her, pretending to be just another dishwasher. He took a deep breath and started a conversation. "Hey, you doing okay?" Jack asked, trying to sound casual, his voice muffled by the noise of the kitchen. Maria looked up at him, her tired eyes barely meeting his. She gave a faint smile but didn't say anything at first. Jack could see that she was holding something back, but he wasn't sure what. He knew she wasn't just tired from a busy shift, there was something more going on. "I'm fine," she said, finally breaking the silence. "Just another day, you know." Jack nodded but could tell it was more than that. He decided to push a little further. "You've been working a lot of double shifts lately, right? How's that been going?" Maria stiffened slightly, and Jack saw the tension in her body. She hesitated for a moment, clearly trying to figure out how much to say. Finally, she spoke again, but her voice was softer, tinged with frustration. "It's been hard," Maria said, her eyes looking away as she spoke. "I've been doing double shifts for weeks now, and I don't mind the work. I'm used to it. But the thing is, they don't pay me for the extra hours. It's like they just expect it, you know." Jack's heart sank. He had suspected something was off, but hearing it from Maria directly was another thing entirely. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she were revealing a deep secret. "I've been asking for overtime pay, but they just ignore me. And when I try to speak up, they act like I'm causing trouble. Like I'm being difficult for asking for what's fair. But I don't know what else to do. I've got bills to pay, and I can't afford to quit. So, I just keep working, hoping one day someone will notice." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Maria wasn't just another employee doing her job. She was being exploited, working longer hours than anyone else without proper compensation. And the worst part was that no one seemed to care. He had always thought of his company as one that valued its employees, but now, standing there listening to Maria's story, he realized just how wrong he had been. Maria's words echoed in Jack's mind as he went back to his work. The kitchen seemed to slow down around him, as if time itself was pausing so he could process everything he had just learned. The laughter and chatter from the front of the restaurant felt distant now. It was as though the world of high-end restaurants and corporate decisions no longer mattered. All that mattered now was Maria's struggle and the struggles of the other employees who were being treated the same way. That evening, as the shift ended and the restaurant started to empty out, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he had to do something. He had to make this right. But what could he do? He was just a dishwasher, after all. No one knew who he really was. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his position was actually an advantage. No one suspected him. He could keep working undercover, learning more about what was going on in the company. He could gather the evidence he needed to bring the issue to light. Over the next few days, Jack continued his undercover work, paying close attention to Maria and the other employees. He started to notice the same pattern of mistreatment across the board. Several of the workers were staying late, working overtime without pay, and being ignored when they asked for help or better conditions. It wasn't just Maria, it was happening to everyone. Jack began to take notes, documenting the hours worked, the lack of overtime pay, and the mistreatment of employees. He spoke to a few others when he could, though many were too afraid to speak out. They had become accustomed to being overworked and underpaid, and the idea of challenging the system seemed impossible. As the days went by, Jack found himself more determined than ever. He had seen enough. He couldn't let this continue. He knew he had to take action, but he had to be careful. If he made one wrong move, everything could fall apart. His plan would have to be precise, and he would need to gather all the evidence before confronting anyone. By the end of the week, Jack had a clearer understanding of the situation than ever before. He had seen how the system was designed to exploit people like Maria, people who were too afraid to speak up, people who needed their jobs but were taken advantage of. But Jack wasn't going to let this go unnoticed. He was going to make things right, no matter what it took. As he left the restaurant that night, Jack felt a deep sense of responsibility weighing on his shoulders. He knew what he had to do, and he was ready to take the next step. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't stand by any longer. He had uncovered the truth, and now it was time to do something about it. As the days passed, Jack's feelings of unease grew into a burning desire to take action. His days as a dishwasher were beginning to blur into one another, the tasks becoming second nature. He had gotten used to the long shifts, the pressure in the kitchen, and the constant hum of activity around him. But despite his growing comfort with the work, his heart ached every time he looked at Maria or any of the other employees who were clearly being taken advantage of. The more he observed, the more he understood the depth of the problem. It wasn't just Maria. There were several others in the restaurant who were working extra hours without pay, staying late to clean up after everyone else, or covering shifts for colleagues who had called in sick. There was a constant sense of urgency in the air, but it wasn't coming from the kitchen staff. It was coming from the management, who constantly pushed the employees to do more, without offering any form of acknowledgement or reward. The system was broken, and Jack now saw it clearly. As the undercover days went on, Jack took his role more seriously. He made it a point to speak to the employees more, pretending to bond over shared frustrations. But his real goal was always to understand their needs and how they were being mistreated. He took notes secretly, documenting every extra shift that wasn't paid, every moment a manager ignored a request for help, and every time a worker, like Maria, quietly shouldered the burden without ever speaking out. It was when Jack heard about one of the newer dishwashers, Jason, that his concern deepened. Jason had joined the restaurant just a few weeks ago and was quickly proving himself to be a hard-working and reliable employee. But the more Jack observed, the more he noticed that Jason was getting pulled into the cycle of unpaid overtime. Jason was eager to please, always volunteering to cover late shifts or work during peak hours. And yet, he hadn't been paid for any of those extra hours. Jack couldn't understand why management was allowing this to happen. Jack decided to approach Jason one evening when the two of them were working side by side, cleaning dishes. The kitchen was quiet, and most of the evening rush was over. Jason was washing dishes at the sink next to Jack, and he looked worn out, just like the others. Jack made small talk, trying to keep the conversation casual. "So, how are you holding up?" Jack asked, his voice low enough that no one else could overhear. Jason shrugged, barely looking up. "Same as usual. Just trying to get through the night. You know how it is." Jack nodded. He'd been asking the same questions every day, and the answers were always the same. Everyone was trying to get through it. But this time, Jack decided to dig a little deeper. He knew that Jason, like Maria, probably wouldn't speak out on his own. He needed to encourage him to open up. "Long hours, huh?" Jack said. "I noticed you've been here pretty late lately. You getting paid for that?" Jason stopped washing for a moment, clearly caught off guard by the question. He looked at Jack, his tired eyes searching his face. For a moment, Jack thought Jason might not say anything. But then, he let out a deep sigh. "Honestly, no," Jason said, his voice quiet. "They keep asking me to stay late, and I'm happy to help out. But they don't pay me for the extra hours. They say it's just part of the job. I don't mind much, I guess. I just need the work." Jack's heart sank as he listened to Jason. He could see that Jason wasn't just working hard, he was desperate. Desperate for a paycheck, for recognition, for stability. And yet, here he was, trapped in a cycle of exploitation that no one seemed to care about. "Does anyone ever say anything to you about it?" Jack asked, trying to sound casual. Jason hesitated, glancing around before lowering his voice. "Not really. I asked my supervisor once if I could get paid for the extra hours, and he told me it wasn't really necessary. That I should just be grateful for the chance to work here. I don't want to rock the boat, you know. I'm just grateful to have a job in the first place." The words hit Jack like a punch to the stomach. How could anyone, especially a manager, say that to someone who was just trying to make ends meet? It was clear that Jason, like Maria, had no choice but to accept the unfair conditions because he was afraid of losing his job. And that fear was being used against him. Jack felt a surge of anger. This was the reality of the system he had built: employees who worked tirelessly, who sacrificed their time and energy, and who were never given the recognition or compensation they deserved. It was a system built on exploitation, and Jack had become part of it. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Over the next few days, Jack continued his undercover work. But now, he had a clear goal: he needed to gather evidence to expose what was happening and bring about change. He couldn't let Maria, Jason, or anyone else continue to suffer in silence. He had to act. Jack spent his shifts documenting everything: the extra hours worked without pay, the ignored requests for breaks, and the way management treated employees like disposable commodities. He also began speaking to more employees, asking them how they were treated and whether they ever received the support they needed. Many of them were hesitant at first, too afraid to speak up for fear of retaliation. But as they began to trust Jack, they opened up, sharing their stories of long hours, low pay, and mistreatment. As Jack listened to their stories, he felt a growing sense of urgency. He knew that he had to act fast before anyone else was hurt by the system. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about fixing a few problems, it was about changing the entire culture of the company. He needed to break down the walls of greed and exploitation that had been built up over the years. One evening, after another grueling shift, Jack sat in his car outside the restaurant, his mind racing. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep going undercover forever. It was time to confront the truth and take a stand. He was the CEO, and it was his responsibility to make things right. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could change the future for his employees. The next day, Jack made a decision that would change everything. He would go to the top. He would bring his findings to the senior management team and expose the truth about what was happening at his restaurants. He would demand accountability and change. It was time to stop hiding behind the mask of corporate success and start doing what was right for the people who had helped build his empire. Jack wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain: he couldn't ignore the problem any longer. The truth had come to light, and now, it was up to him to fix it. The next day, Jack woke up with a sense of urgency, knowing that the time had come to confront the truth. He had spent the last few weeks in the kitchen, working side by side with his employees, learning about the exploitation they endured, and documenting everything. Jack had never felt more conflicted in his life. On one hand, he knew the truth now, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. On the other hand, he feared the consequences of speaking up. Would the management team listen? Would they be willing to change? And what would happen to the employees like Maria and Jason, who had trusted him with their stories? Jack couldn't ignore the reality he had uncovered. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. He had built this company from the ground up, and yet he had allowed it to become a place where hard-working people were being taken advantage of. He had allowed the culture of greed to creep in, making profits the priority over the well-being of his employees. It was a hard pill to swallow, but Jack knew he had to do something about it. After much deliberation, Jack decided to meet with his senior management team. It was the only way to address the issue head-on. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and there would likely be pushback, but he was prepared. He was no longer the disconnected CEO who only cared about profits. He was a man who had seen firsthand the struggles of his employees, and he couldn't turn back now. That afternoon, Jack called an emergency meeting with the management team. As they gathered in the sleek, modern conference room, Jack's heart raced. He had spent years leading these people, making tough decisions, and achieving success. But now, he was about to reveal something that would shake the very foundation of the company. The room was filled with a sense of tension, as Jack's team looked at him with curiosity, unaware of what was coming. "Thank you all for joining on short notice," Jack began, his voice steady but firm. "I've been spending a lot of time thinking about the direction of this company. And I've come to a realization: we've lost sight of what truly matters. We've become too focused on profits, expansion, and bottom lines, while neglecting the people who make this company successful." His words were met with silence. The senior managers exchanged confused glances, clearly unsure of where Jack was headed. They had come to expect discussions about growth strategies or market trends, not this kind of reflection. Jack paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to sink in before continuing. "I've spent the past few weeks working undercover in our restaurants," Jack confessed, his eyes scanning the room. "I've been washing dishes, working shifts just like our employees, and seeing firsthand the conditions they've been enduring." At this, there was a ripple of surprise. Some of the managers looked at each other in disbelief, while others looked uneasy, sensing that Jack wasn't simply offering a casual update. "I've witnessed exploitation," Jack continued, his voice gaining strength. "Employees, like Maria and Jason, have been working double shifts without overtime pay. They've been going above and beyond, and yet they're being treated like their efforts don't matter. I've seen how we've failed to support our workers, how we've allowed them to be taken advantage of, and it's time to change that." The room went silent. Jack's words hung in the air, and he could feel the tension rising. Some of the managers shifted in their seats, while others seemed stunned into silence. One of the senior managers, Robert, cleared his throat and leaned forward, his expression a mix of concern and disbelief. "Jack," Robert began, his voice tight, "I'm not sure where you're going with this. We've always prided ourselves on our success. We've worked hard to build this company. Are you suggesting that we've been doing something wrong?" Jack took a deep breath, unwilling to back down. "I'm not saying that we haven't worked hard. But we've been focusing on the wrong things. The people who have made this company what it is, our chefs, dishwashers, servers, are being exploited. We've allowed a culture of fear and pressure to grow, where employees are too afraid to speak up about unfair working conditions because they fear losing their jobs. And that's on us." Another manager, Sarah, chimed in, her voice filled with defensiveness. "But Jack, we're a business. We have to think about the bottom line. Yes, we want to take care of our employees, but at the end of the day, we need to make sure the company is profitable." Jack nodded, but his eyes were firm. "I understand that, Sarah. But what's the point of profitability if we're sacrificing the well-being of the people who work for us? We can't keep making money at the expense of our employees. They're the ones who've been working tirelessly to keep this company running, and they deserve to be treated with respect and fairness." The room grew quieter as Jack's words sank in. There was no denying the truth of what he was saying. Even those who had been skeptical couldn't help but see the reality that Jack was laying out. They had been too focused on the business side of things to notice the struggles of the employees on the front lines. Jack took a deep breath and continued. "I'm not asking for drastic changes overnight, but I am asking for us to start doing better. We need to ensure that every employee is fairly compensated for their work. We need to offer proper overtime pay. We need to stop the cycle of exploitation and create a work environment where people feel valued, not just as workers, but as human beings." The senior management team was silent for a moment. Jack could see that they were processing what he had said. He didn't expect them to agree immediately, but he was willing to have the hard conversations. He was ready to push through the resistance because he knew it was the right thing to do. Finally, Robert spoke up, his voice softer than before. "Jack, this is a big shift for us. It's going to take time to implement these changes, and there's no telling how it will affect our bottom line. But if what you're saying is true, then maybe it's time for us to rethink how we've been doing things." Jack nodded, appreciating Robert's willingness to listen. "It won't be easy, but it's necessary. We'll start by ensuring fair pay for all employees. We'll create a system for tracking overtime hours. We'll bring in new training programs for managers to help them recognize when employees are being overworked or mistreated. But most importantly, we'll make sure that every employee knows they matter to this company. Another manager, Linda, finally spoke up. Jack, I'm with you. I think we've lost sight of the people who made us successful. It's time we showed them that they matter. Jack smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't a full victory yet, but it was a start. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he was on the right path. As the meeting ended, Jack stood up, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The next steps were clear. The changes wouldn't happen overnight, but now that the management team was on board, the process could begin. It was time to rebuild the company from the inside out, to create a culture of fairness, respect, and accountability. Jack knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be setbacks, resistance, and growing pains. But as he left the meeting room, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just the CEO anymore. He was someone who had witnessed the struggles of his employees, and he was ready to make sure those struggles would no longer go unnoticed. The battle for change had just begun, but Jack was ready for it. He had the power to make a difference, and he wasn't going to stop until every employee at Gourmet Haven was treated with the respect and fairness they deserved. It was time to lead with integrity and compassion, and he was prepared to do whatever it took. The days that followed the meeting felt like a whirlwind. Jack had made a decision, and now the real work had begun. The senior management team had agreed to the changes he proposed, but he knew that turning those words into real, meaningful action wouldn't be easy. The road ahead would be filled with obstacles, both expected and unforeseen. But Jack was ready for the challenge. He started by personally meeting with Maria and Jason. They were two of the employees he had worked alongside during his undercover stint, and Jack knew that if things were going to change, they needed to see that he was serious about making a difference. He asked them to meet him in the quiet corner of the restaurant one evening after the dinner rush. When they arrived, both of them looked surprised but curious. Jack smiled at them and motioned for them to sit down. "Thank you both for taking the time to meet with me," Jack began, his tone sincere. "I wanted to talk to you directly because I want you to know that the changes I've been talking about are not just words. I'm committed to making this a better place for everyone who works here." Maria and Jason exchanged uncertain glances. They had heard many promises from management before, but none of those promises had ever amounted to anything. Still, there was something different in Jack's voice this time. "I know things haven't been fair," Jack continued. "And I've seen firsthand how hard you both work, and how much you give to this company. You deserve better than what you've been given. I've made it my mission to change that." Jack explained the steps the company was going to take, ensuring overtime pay, improving management practices, offering more support for workers, and creating an environment where every employee's voice mattered. He promised them that their hard work would no longer go unnoticed. Maria, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. "Do you really think things will change? You've been the CEO for years, and nothing ever changed before." Jack nodded, understanding the skepticism in her voice. "I get why you'd feel that way. I was blind to what was happening here. But I've seen it now, and I can't turn a blind eye again. I can't undo the past, but I'm going to make sure the future is better for everyone here. That's a promise." Jason, who had been quietly absorbing the conversation, nodded slowly. "I appreciate that. It's been tough. I've been working 2 jobs just to make ends meet, and it's exhausting. But if you really mean what you say, I'm willing to give this a chance." The sincerity in their words struck Jack deeply. He realized that for all the work he had put into building this company, he had neglected the very people who made it possible. The employees were the heart of the business, and he had to show them that they mattered. Over the next few weeks, Jack threw himself into implementing the changes. The first step was rolling out a new, transparent system for tracking hours worked. No more hidden overtime. No more workers going unpaid for their efforts. Every employee would now receive fair compensation for the hours they put in. Jack also started meeting with managers and supervisors to discuss the new approach. They were all on board, but Jack knew there would be resistance from some corners. Change was never easy, and there would always be people who preferred the old ways. But Jack was determined to push through it. He also worked on creating new programs for employee development. He wanted to ensure that workers like Maria and Jason could grow in their roles and move up within the company. He started an internal mentorship program, where experienced employees could guide newer staff, providing training and support. The goal was to empower the employees and give them a sense of ownership over their work. It wasn't just about making them feel valued, it was about giving them the tools to succeed. But the biggest change came when Jack announced the creation of an employee advisory board. The board would be made up of workers from all levels of the restaurant: dishwashers, servers, chefs, anyone who had a stake in the company. This board would have a direct line to Jack, giving employees a platform to voice concerns, suggest improvements, and help shape the direction of the company. When Jack shared this news with the staff, the response was overwhelming. For the first time in a long time, the employees felt like they had a say in what was happening at Gourmet Haven. They weren't just cogs in a machine anymore, they were valued members of the team. The change wasn't instantaneous, and there were challenges along the way. But Jack began to notice a difference. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. Employees were happier, more engaged, and more willing to speak up when something wasn't right. They no longer feared the consequences of challenging the system. Instead, they felt empowered to make the workplace better for everyone. Maria, who had been promoted to supervisor, was one of the first to notice the impact of the changes. She had always worked hard, but now, she was in a position to help others do the same. She was able to ensure that no one worked overtime without pay and that every worker was treated with respect. The transformation wasn't just in the way the company operated, it was in the culture that had developed, where kindness, fairness, and support were prioritized over profits. As for Jason, his life began to change as well. He no longer had to work 2 jobs to make ends meet. He was able to take on more responsibility at work and was even given a raise to reflect his increased role. He felt a renewed sense of loyalty to the company, not just because of the pay, but because he could see that Jack genuinely cared about the people who worked for him. The success of the changes was soon reflected in the company's overall performance. Employee turnover decreased dramatically, and workers were more productive and motivated than ever before. There was a renewed sense of pride in the restaurant. Customers noticed the difference too. The staff was more attentive, more enthusiastic, and more connected to the company's mission. One day, as Jack walked through the restaurant, observing the changes for himself, he couldn't help but smile. The once cold and impersonal atmosphere had been replaced by one of warmth, respect, and collaboration. He knew that the road ahead wasn't without challenges, but the company was now on a path that was sustainable, not just in terms of profits, but in terms of people. He found Maria and Jason working together in the kitchen, overseeing the operations. They were chatting and laughing as they worked, the atmosphere light and welcoming. Jack walked up to them and paused for a moment before speaking. "I just wanted to thank you both," Jack said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you. Your hard work, your commitment, it's what has made this possible." "Thank you." Maria smiled and nodded. "It's been a long journey, but we're getting there. Thank you for listening to us. That's all we really needed." Jason, who had been a bit more reserved in the past, grinned. "We just needed someone to believe in us, and now we can believe in the company too." Jack felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had done more than just fix a broken system, he had helped rebuild trust. He had helped people see that their voices mattered. In doing so, he had created something far more valuable than just a successful restaurant. He had created a community, a place where people could grow, succeed, and be treated with dignity. As Jack walked away, he felt a deep sense of pride in what he had accomplished. The road to change had been long, but it had been worth it. Jack knew that this was just the beginning. The company had been transformed, and so had he. He was no longer just the CEO of a successful business. He was a leader who understood that success was measured not just by the bottom line, but by the impact it had on the lives of those who made that success possible. It was a new chapter for Gourmet Haven, and for Jack, it was the beginning of a future built on fairness, respect, and genuine care for the people who mattered most.